All right, I want you to start with number one is, let's see if you remember how to do this kind. F of x equals x minus 5, and g of x is equal to the square root of x. I'd like you to figure out the domain of f, the domain of g, and I'd like you to tell me what would happen if you took f of x over g of x. What would you get, and what would be its domain? That's a review question from yesterday. I'm going to pause. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people done, so that's awesome. Domain of f is all real numbers, because you can't crash that thing. It doesn't have a square root, and it doesn't have a denominator. Next, the domain of g. I like to do these with number lines. I've talked to kids, and they generally agree that these work best as number line questions. And because then you can see where they line up with each other. This one, we want what's underneath there. We normally say is x is greater than or equal to 0. Whatever's underneath there, we set greater than or equal to 0. So here's 0, and greater than or equal to means like this. Raise your hand if you're with me so far. Okay, good. The third part is, if you're going to do a domain of this kind, there was a third thing you had to watch out for. Do you remember it? Remember what to do? Figure out when what is a problem. When 0 is a problem. And so if g of x turns into 0, I'll have a problem. Look at g of x. Is there a way it could turn into 0? Yes, so you'd set the third number line to be domain where g cannot be 0. If you didn't already do one of this number line, do it now. You need to learn this. These are the tricky ones that have 3 number lines to line up. The 2 parents plus whatever makes the denominator 0. All right. If domain of g cannot be 0, as in domain for g cannot be 0, is what would make this thing 0 is if x was 0. So the point is, you can't let it be 0. It normally can be 0. But why can't it be 0? Because we can't have a 0 on the bottom. So everything is okay except 0 for this. It's just saying what would make g 0. So now, where do they overlap? They can't overlap anywhere in this area because of this guy. So it doesn't work anywhere in here. It does work in here. Does it actually work at 0? No. So your final answer for the domain of the combination of these would be that it's from 0 to infinity where it cannot be 0. And all it would take, don't let yourself think, oh, I had a bracket. I was close. You know, I would have gotten it. No, you wouldn't have. Because a bracket is totally different than a parenthesis here. Because that means you didn't understand this whole thing about how g can't be 0. So a parenthesis here was key. All right, that's the domain of my combined function. But what is the actual combined function? F of x over g of x. So I have to take f of x, which is x minus 5, over g of x, which is square root of x. And there it is, and that's good enough. That's your function. This is its domain. Raise your hand if you get that. Okay, good. Now moving on. Some of you aren't with me. Get back with me. You're staying at your iPad, you're not with me. All right. Thank you. Yes? Yes, for a second. There is a parenthesis on the 0. Yes, that's not a bracket. Another parenthesis on the 0? Okay, all I need is one parenthesis on the 0 and one parenthesis on the infinity. So from 0 to infinity, that's it. If you're thinking it can also work in here, it can't, because this one right here wasn't allowed in that zone. So, all right, so moving on to a new kind of question. F of g of x. Do you remember putting a function inside another function? It's like the f function swallowed the g function. You think of like a giant snake with like a, I don't know, there's some really big snakes like down in Central America, and they can swallow things like the size of deer. And as it's going through their system, there's like this big bulge in the deer. Well, this is like the thing that got swallowed. All right, so if I just ask you for a simple one here, would you please find f of g of x if f of x is 2x plus 1 and g of x is x squared? Just put the one function in the other function. Make sure you know how to do that. This is review. You did learn this in higher algebra. It's called a compositional function. So this function needs to go into this function. Where can it go in? It can go into the variable. So I would write out the 2 empty spot plus 1. And then I drop in x squared. Raise your hand if you had that right. Okay, good. Then you know how to put a function in another function. If you don't get that part, you'll have to talk to me individually because I need to move on. If our function is this now, that's our new function, then how do we tell what its domain is? There's a different set of rules for this. Okay? These are not just take the two parents, f and g, and overlap them. That's what we did for the other kind. But for this kind, I'm going to pause for a second here. Okay, to do this one, we need two number lines to overlap. It's the domain of the inside and the domain of the new function. Domain of the inside and domain of the new. Make yourself good notes. It's one of the keys to doing well in school, and you got some in front of you still. Quite a few years for a lot of you. Many of you are going to go on past your 4-year degree because almost everybody gets a 4-year degree nowadays. So to get ahead, you have to get like a master's degree. So a lot of you have 6 years after high school still in front of you. And to do well in school, you need to be able to take notes. All right, so if you're writing this down as a good example for yourself, here's my new function. What's its domain? Is there anything that crashes it? That's what you should ask yourself. Nothing crashes it because it doesn't have a square root and it doesn't have a denominator. So nothing crashes it, all reals. How about the domain of the inside function? What was the inside function? Look back, it's the g one. Look at the g function. What's the domain of that? All real numbers. So since this was an easy one, all real numbers and all real numbers, where do they overlap? All real numbers. Final answer for the domain of this is the domain of my new function is all reals. And why can't I just take the domain of this? Because the original problem might have had a weakness on the g of x that wouldn't show up. You cannot, and I repeat this, just look at this and say, what's its domain? That will not work. You have to do this guy's domain and the inside function's domain. That's the only way you can tell for sure what the final answer is for the domain of that function. In this case, here's my new function, and its domain is all reals, or from negative infinity to positive infinity. All right, I want to give you one like that, but I'd like to actually start your homework, given the amount of time we have left in class. So would you please take out your homework. You're going to find it in the folder. It's called 1.4.2. I'm going to pause for a second while we get that up on the screen. 1.4.2. All right, so let's start it together. Number one, it gives me two functions, f of x and g of x, and you know why these are really easy ones? Because what's the domain of the f function there? All reals. What's the domain of the g function? All reals. So the domain of it is going to be all reals. Okay, but we should check it and make sure that we're not doing something wrong here. So let's do one step at a time here. F of g of x. Put the g into the f function. Put this into this function. Pause for a second. All right, so here it is. You should have put the g into the f function, that into that, 3 empty spot plus 2, and drop in x plus 1. And what did I just figure out? I just figured out f of g of x is this. I should probably move that over to make it a little easier to read. There we go. Okay. Now, what am I supposed to do? It's domain. To do the domain, if you just say all reals, you will get it wrong. You have to show how you got the domain. This needs two number lines overlap. The domain of the inside and the domain of the new. Okay, the domain of the new, can anything crash that? Nope. So you say all reals, so you just color in a number line all the way, or you could say all reals. I like the number line technique. The domain of the inside, that was also all reals. Where do they overlap? Everywhere. So the answer for the domain of this function, its domain is all real numbers, or from negative infinity to positive infinity. Okay, now let's do one that actually is going to have domain issues. Look at this one. What I recommend you do on these problems, since the domain is always the hard part, is find the domain of each thing right away. So right underneath your f of x, I would write its domain. It's going to be, I'm telling you, I've done a lot of these problems, a ton of them, over many years of Precalc. This works. Domain of f. What is it? Come on, what is it? All reals. Okay, or a number line that goes forever in both directions. Now, right underneath that, I'd put the domain of g. Because what if their answer was to overlap those two number lines? So it'd be nice to have them right next to each other, right? Domain of g, everything except what? Close. If I put in a 0 here, I don't have a problem. If I put in a 1, I have a problem. So everything except 1. Okay, now, do you get this kind of domain by overlapping the two parents? No, you don't. You get this by doing the domain of the new and the domain of the inside. Domain of the new one and the domain of the inside one. The inside one is, if I'm doing g of f of x, it's different than if I'm doing f of g of x. All right, so which one should I start with? I guess I will start with doing f of g of x. So g is the inside one. So the inside one is all reals. No, wait, g's that one. Sorry. I have to go back and put a 1. There we go. And domain of my new function. Well, I haven't actually put f of g of x together yet. So I'm going to do that next. F of g of x. I put the g function into the f function. F of, I got to put the f function down. F function is empty spot squared minus 1. There's my f function. I'm going to drop in the g function. 1 over x minus 1. There we go. There's my new function, f of g of x. I drop the one function into the other. Now what's this, guys? This is the new function. This is the new creation. It's the child function. What's its domain? There's only one thing that would crash it. What? 1. So everything except 1. The new function's got an issue at 1. The inside function, this guy, he had an issue at 1. They both have an issue at 1. So how do I say the final answer then? Final answer is this part from here to here, which is from negative infinity until 1, union with this part, which is from 1 to infinity. Sorry, I got a little scrunchy there. But here is your f of g of x, and here is its domain, which we got by doing the domain of the new overlapping with the domain of the inside. Now that's just f of g of x. The reason you have the whole page to do these problems is because you have do it once with f of g of x, and then you do it again with g of f of x. G of f of x, I can start with a g function, 1 over empty spot where the x was, minus 1, oops, minus 1, and then I drop in the other function, which is x squared minus 1 goes in here. Now, this is g of f of x. And now if I want to get its domain, I got to find the domain of the inside and the domain of the new. The inside function was f of x. That's this one. What's its domain? All reals. the domain of the new function, I got to look at my new creation here, the Frankenchild. And if this was equal to 1, then I'd have a 0 on the bottom. So obviously that would cause a problem. So we want it so that x squared minus 1, okay, this part's in parentheses, has to equal 0, and that'll be our key spot. We don't want it to equal 0 because it'll crash the function. So I'm solving this. I'm going x squared minus 1 equals 1, and then I'm going to drop those parentheses. X squared minus 1 equals 1. Then I'm going to add 1 to both sides. X squared equals 2. And 2 seconds ago we practiced solving those. How do you finish this? And here's your chance to screw up. Everybody says square root of 2. It's wrong. What is the actual answer? Plus and minus the square root of 2. All right. So there's 2 things that would crash this function. Square root of 2 would crash it because when you square it, you get 2, and then 2 minus 1 makes 1, and 1 minus 1 makes 0. Bottom became 0. And negative square root of 2 also crashes it. So the new function has 2 weaknesses. Negative square root of 2 and positive square root of 2. Those are 2 things it can't have. And the rest of everything else will be okay. So now, what is the domain of this? I have to say, in that area it works, in this area it works, and in that area it works. There's 3 parts to it. Negative infinity up until negative root 2. Union with the next part, negative root 2 to positive root 2. It's a square root of 2. I don't know if that square root sign fell off or what happened there. And then union with square root of 2 to infinity. Got scrunched again. Maybe I can just move it over. Hold on a sec. There. There. Nobody said Precalc was going to be easy. A lot of little details. The way I like to describe it is none of these are really hard by themselves, but there's just so many steps. You see how it'd be easy to forget that negative square root of 2 all of a sudden, and now the whole problem's wrong. You forget this right here, whole problem's wrong. That's why I need you to know those basic skills. All right. So that's all I have for the new stuff for today. My students, because I'm assigning you a top 20 tonight, I'm going to cut your homework down a little bit further. I'm going to tell my classes which ones they can skip.